Imagine yourself in a situation where the world around you demands an immediate response, an action that could determine the course of an entire operation, the fate of many lives. Now imagine that the decision you make will be judged by everyone around you, even by the people you have always admired and respected. You're at the center of a mission of extreme importance. One where any mistake could be fatal. Where the lives of hundreds of people depend on your ability to make quick, precise decisions. However, at a crucial moment, you do something unexpected. You refuse a public order that everyone expects you to follow. This is the dilemma of our protagonist. A woman whose courage is tested in extreme ways. She's an officer in an elite tactical unit, respected and trusted. Her journey up to this point hasn't been easy, but she's always been recognized for her intelligence, dedication, and coldness when making decisions in extreme situations. Yet, in this specific moment, something inside her tells her that the order she's about to receive isn't the best course of action. And it was then, in the middle of preparations for the mission, that her first major decision would take shape. The order was given. A clear and direct order. Attack the enemy base. We will rescue the hostages and take control of the area immediately. A simple order, no room for doubt, something that seemed to make sense at first. It was a strategy of direct confrontation, an operation with brute force to recover the hostages and conquer the area. However, to the protagonist, something didn't feel right. She knew that a direct offensive meant one thing, a high risk of failure. A frontal confrontation with well-armed and well-positioned enemy forces could lead to the death of hostages, soldiers, and civilians. Chaos would ensue, and while it was a risky mission, she didn't believe it was the right way to act. It wasn't just an operation that might be seen as heroic, but one that could lead to failure and unnecessary loss of life. And it was then that she made the choice that would change everything. Instead of following the order to the letter, she decided to refuse. Not with a shout of insubordination, but with a calm, firm tone. "We won't attack directly," she said, with the conviction of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "The best chance to rescue the hostages and neutralize enemy forces is through silent infiltration. We need to act in the shadows, without them noticing, with precision and strategy." The reaction was immediate and brutal. The commander looked at her as if he had just heard the most unbelievable thing. Her team, initially silent, began to murmur. Eyes shifted, unspoken words filled the air. The protagonist knew that her decision wouldn't be well received, but she hadn't anticipated just how impactful it would be. Silence was quickly broken by an angry shout from one of her team members. "You're hiding. That's cowardice. This is not how we do things." The atmosphere grew thick with tension, as if a shadow had fallen over the group. The protagonist felt as though she had been transported into a parallel reality, where everyone was ready to judge her, where the world seemed to turn against her. But still, she held her ground, unwavering, not showing any sign of regret. Her mind was clear, and she knew that what she was doing was right. "You can't just refuse an order like that." The commander's voice was harsh, now filled with frustration. "This is no longer about the mission. It's about you and your inability to face the reality of war." His words hit like a blow, each one sharper than the last. The commander, who had always been respected for his uncompromising stance, now viewed her as someone who had failed. He couldn't comprehend that her decision, while seemingly cowardly, was actually a calculated move to save lives. Soon, other team members began to voice their opinions. The pressure was building to unbearable levels. "You're putting us all at risk. Why don't you trust us? This is a mission of war, and you should be at the front with all of us." Another voice rose, more outraged. "What kind of leader refuses an order? You have to be brave and fight alongside us, not hide behind strategies." The words coward and escape started flying in the air like sharp stones. Hitting at the very core of her confidence, she felt every word like a blade slicing through her soul. It was a battle not just against the enemy, but against her own allies, the people she respected and shared a bond of brotherhood with. The isolation was overwhelming. The feeling of being abandoned, judged without being understood, sank deeper into her chest. But inside, she knew that her decision, though hard, was the only way forward. The mission continued, but she would now have to face not just the enemy, but the weight of being alone. The team had fractured. Some of her teammates quietly supported her, but most began to distance themselves, questioning their beliefs about leadership and courage. The moral fabric that once seemed unbreakable was now under severe strain. The work that had once seemed natural was now burdened by an invisible weight of distrust. She knew that what she had done was right, but the emotional toll of being isolated from her own team was taking its toll. As she made her way through the aftermath of her decision, the weight of the words thrown at her, the accusations of cowardice, seemed to grow heavier, but deep down, she understood that the real challenge was not in what others thought of her, but in holding firm to what she believed to be the right course of action. Her decision, though misunderstood, had been a sacrifice she was willing to make for the greater good. And though she was now a pariah in the eyes of many, she would continue forward, knowing that her strength came not from the approval of others, but from the courage to do what she knew was right, no matter the cost. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to make a difficult decision, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to continue following this incredible journey. The battlefield was tense. The mission had been laid out in front of the team, and the weight of the task ahead was suffocating. The lives of many were at stake. In that moment, everything seemed to hinge on one decision. The order had come through, and there was no mistaking it. The plan was clear, direct, and simple. Attack the enemy base head-on, rescue the hostages, and take control. For most, it seemed like the only course of action. But for the protagonist, it felt wrong. She had always prided herself on her ability to think ahead, to see the battlefield beyond just the obvious. As a leader, she had learned over the years that success wasn't just about charging in with force. It was about using your mind, understanding your enemy, and positioning yourself to win the war before it even started. This mission, however, felt rushed. There was no room for hesitation, and that was what disturbed her. She didn't think a direct attack would work. It felt like a suicide mission, too much risk for too little reward. The hostages would be at risk. Her team would be at risk. And for what? Glory. A momentary victory. She was faced with a choice that most people in her position would never dream of: follow the order, or defy it and find another way. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew that following the order would lead to disaster. Her training, her instincts, all told her that there was a better way, one that involved patience, precision, and calculated risks. And so, in that moment of profound responsibility, she chose the path less traveled. With her heart pounding, she made her move. "We're not going to attack directly," she said, her voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. The eyes of her team turned toward her, confusion and disbelief in their gaze. "We'll infiltrate quietly. We'll work in the shadows. We'll neutralize the enemy without them knowing we're here," she continued. It wasn't what anyone expected to hear. The team had been trained for direct combat, for charging into the fray with guns blazing. No one had ever expected a leader to back down from a fight. They were soldiers, they followed orders, they fought. And here she was, refusing the very order that would define them as warriors. To them, it felt like cowardice. "You're being weak," one of her teammates said, his voice thick with frustration. "This isn't how we do things. We're here to fight, not to hide." Another member of the team spoke up. "If we don't attack, we're just giving them time to prepare. We'll be walking into a trap." The comments came fast and harsh. Her decision was being dissected, ripped apart in front of her. She could feel the weight of every word, the sting of the judgment. To them, she was no longer the fearless leader they had once trusted. She had become the woman who was afraid to fight, the woman who couldn't do what needed to be done. She stood there, knowing what was at stake, but more certain of her decision than ever. She wasn't afraid to fight. She wasn't afraid to risk her life or the lives of her team. But she knew there were smarter ways to win this battle. The lives of the hostages depended on it, and that, to her, was worth more than any fleeting victory or personal glory. Despite the barrage of insults and disapproval from her team, the protagonist held her ground. She wasn't going to back down, not when the lives of the innocent were at risk. The mission had to succeed, not through brute force, but through precision, stealth, and careful planning. In her mind, the true test of courage wasn't charging headfirst into danger. It was having the wisdom to wait, to think, and to act, only when the time was right. But as the murmurs of discontent grew louder, so did the weight of the decision she had. What do you think of the protagonist's decision? Do you think she was right to refuse the order? Or do you believe she should have followed the team's lead and attacked directly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this intense journey and want to see how it all unfolds, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter of this gripping story. Let's explore the next twist together. The moment the protagonist refused to follow the order, she knew she had set something in motion that could never be undone. The air was thick with tension as her voice rang out, calmly rejecting the attack order that everyone had assumed would be the next step. She had chosen a different path, a path that required her to act in secrecy, with precision and patience, instead of rushing headlong into battle. Almost instantly, the weight of her decision became clear. The team fell into a stunned silence, but it didn't last long. The first harsh words came from her right-hand man, someone she had trusted and worked alongside for years. "What are you doing?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "You can't refuse an order like that. We don't do that. We're soldiers, not cowards. Why are you backing out? If you're not going to fight, then maybe you don't belong here." Another voice chimed in, this one laced with contempt. "You've got to be kidding. Are we really going to hide and wait like cowards?" Her heart sank, not from fear, but from the realization that her decision had fractured the unity they had once shared. Her team was no longer in sync. Some looked at her with confusion, others with outright anger. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time in her career, she felt the weight of being isolated, standing alone against those who had once followed her without question. Her mind raced, but she didn't let the pressure show. She stood her ground, every ounce of her military training pushing her to maintain her composure, to act with the kind of confidence that would bring them back from the brink. But inside, she could feel the sting of being branded as a traitor, as someone who lacked courage. For the first time, she doubted herself, not because of the choice she had made, but because of how her team perceived her. The implications were immediate. The other soldiers, who had always admired her for her decisiveness and leadership, were now questioning whether they had followed the right person into battle. It wasn't just about a strategic choice anymore. It was about identity, trust, and the values they had once shared. If she was wrong, if the team failed now, the blame would fall squarely on her shoulders. The doubts were spreading like wildfire. The commander, who had given the initial order, was the next to speak. His words were sharp, filled with disbelief and frustration. "This is a direct violation of protocol," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're jeopardizing everything. If you're not going to fight with us, then you're against us. You're putting us all in danger." His reaction was the hardest to bear. She had expected it, but hearing him say it out loud, accusing her of failing her duty, made her feel the enormity of the consequences. The commander had always been a figure of authority, a mentor even, and to now be on the receiving end of his reprimands felt like a punch to the gut. But she held her ground. "I'm not against you," she said firmly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "I'm doing this to save lives, including yours." But her words fell on deaf ears. The commander's mind was made up. To him, there was no room for such disobedience. He saw only failure in her decision. There was no time for explanations, no room for understanding. He viewed her refusal as weakness, as a betrayal of the mission they had all sworn to carry out. The impact was felt most keenly by the team. The unspoken bond they had shared was now cracked, and the respect they had for her as a leader seemed to be slipping away. Some of the soldiers looked to the commander for reassurance, silently siding with him, while others looked at her with a mix of uncertainty and disdain. She tried to explain herself, but the words felt hollow. The tension in the air thickened with every moment, and she could sense the shift in the atmosphere. What had once been a cohesive team now seemed fractured, divided between those who trusted her and those who doubted her every move. As the hours passed, the weight of the decision grew heavier. Her refusal had set off a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. The team had lost their faith in her, and with it, the unity they had relied on to survive in the most dangerous of circumstances. She knew that she had to regain that trust, but that would take more than just words. It would take actions that could prove her vision was right, that her strategy would work where the brute force of the commander's plan would have failed. In the quiet moments after the confrontation, she found herself reflecting on the true cost of leadership. Being a leader wasn't just about making the right calls in the eyes of the hierarchy. It was about making the hard choices when everyone else was looking to you for guidance. But the harsh reality was that sometimes, doing what was right meant standing alone and facing the consequences alone. The mission was still on the line. The stakes were as high as ever, but now she had to fight not only the enemy but the divisions within her own team. They no longer saw her as the person they had followed into countless battles. To some, she was the traitor, the coward. To others, she was still their leader, the person who had made the hardest decision for the greater good. And so, the question remained: could she win back their trust? Could she convince them that her refusal was not a sign of weakness, but a strategy to save their lives, to save the mission? Only time would tell. But the road ahead was now a lonely one. Do you think the protagonist was right to refuse the order? Or do you believe she should have followed the command, despite the risks? What would you have done in her position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've been following this story and want to see what happens next, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. You won't want to miss what comes next in this thrilling journey. While the tension in the air after the protagonist's refusal to follow the order was still thick, and her team began to fracture, something crucial was happening in the background. The protagonist's decision to act against what everyone expected was not born out of fear or cowardice, as many believed. It was, in fact, a calculated move, a strategic choice based on careful analysis of the situation, an understanding that in this mission, intelligence, precision, and timing were the true weapons, not sheer force. She had seen the bigger picture, long before anyone else. And now it was time to reveal the layers of her plan. The protagonist knew that a direct attack would lead to disaster. The plan was built on the assumption that the enemy would be taken by surprise. But she understood the reality of the terrain, the enemy's fortifications, and the hostages' positions. A frontal assault would be predictable, reckless, and highly dangerous, especially given that the hostages were trapped in a highly vulnerable position. What would seem like a brave and decisive move on the outside would, in her eyes, be nothing more than a death sentence for those she was trying to save. But she couldn't explain it to them right then. There wasn't time. Instead of explaining the fine details of her reasoning, she had to make a quick decision, one that would lead them all to safety. In that moment, the protagonist knew that being labeled a coward or a traitor would be the cost of her plan. But it was a price she was willing to pay. She wasn't refusing to fight. She was refusing to throw them all into an unwinnable situation. Her alternative approach involved patience, subtlety, and a much more complex series of steps that would unfold over time. Rather than charging in with guns blazing, she proposed using stealth to their advantage. The element of surprise, when done correctly, could win wars more decisively than any full-on assault, and it would save lives. Before anything else, the protagonist began laying the groundwork for her secret strategy. She knew that if she was to make her refusal of the order work, it would require more than just her skills. It would require the help of a few trusted members of the team, those who still had faith in her leadership, those who were willing to see the bigger picture. In the days following the confrontation, she quietly worked behind the scenes, gathering intelligence, This was a step most of her team had not considered: observing, listening, and piecing together the enemy's patterns. The protagonist had spent hours combing through satellite images, intercepted communications, and on-the-ground intelligence reports. What she uncovered was both shocking and crucial. The enemy was not as unprepared as they had assumed. Their defenses were tighter than expected, and the risk of triggering a trap was far too high. But what most of the team hadn't seen was that the protagonist had begun a new mission: to infiltrate the enemy's lines without being noticed, to move quietly and strategically through the base, and to take out the most critical points without ever alerting the enemy to their presence. Her refusal wasn't a sign of fear. It was the mark of a leader who was willing to risk everything to ensure success. The new plan was clear. There was no need to attack directly. Instead, the team would infiltrate, use the element of surprise to their advantage, and then neutralize the enemy's defenses one by one. The protagonist knew that this approach required the utmost patience and precision. She needed her team to trust her hand. She needed to show them that there was another way to achieve the mission, without throwing lives away. In this new strategy, every member of the team would play a role, but they would have to do so quietly, without the usual brash attacks that characterized the military's typical method of operation. They would go unnoticed, like shadows, taking out key positions in the enemy's defense systems, all while rescuing the hostages without a single shot being fired. The protagonist knew that time was a luxury they didn't have. Every moment they wasted would increase the risk of discovery. Yet, she still believed that this method was the only way to ensure they didn't just rescue the hostages, but also ensured that no one else was lost in the process. The key was to act swiftly and efficiently without revealing themselves, creating chaos from within the enemy's lines. But convincing her team wasn't easy. Many still saw the protagonist's refusal as a betrayal. To them, disobeying the command seemed like weakness, not strategy. However, as they moved forward with the operation, the protagonist knew that the trust of her team was paramount. She worked with a select few, those who still believed in her judgment, to prepare the infiltration plan. Quietly, in the dead of night, they went over their movements, prepared their gear, and rehearsed their steps. The protagonist knew that her team had doubts. She could see it in their eyes. The same soldiers who had once followed her without hesitation now questioned her every move. But she couldn't afford to let that distract her. Her mission was bigger than their doubts. She was committed to seeing it through, no matter the cost. When the night of the operation finally arrived, the team moved swiftly and silently. They were ghosts in the shadows, unseen by the enemy, but always one step ahead. The protagonist led them through the enemy lines, carefully taking down key positions, disabling communication systems, and creating a path for the hostages to be freed. Each step, each move, was done with purpose, ensuring that no one would be left behind. But the tension was palpable. Every member of the team knew that one wrong move could expose them all, and the consequences would be devastating. Yet, as the hours passed, the team began to realize that the protagonist's plan was working. The hostages were being rescued, the enemy defenses were crumbling, and the team was moving with a precision they hadn't thought possible. In the end, what had seemed like a cowardly refusal to fight turned out to be a masterstroke of military strategy. The protagonist had not only saved the hostages, but she had also outsmarted the enemy, neutralizing their defenses without firing a single shot. And as they made their final escape, with the mission accomplished and everyone safely out of harm's way, the team couldn't deny it anymore. She had been right all along. With the team now fully committed to the protagonist's strategy, the atmosphere had shifted. What once felt like an impossible mission to many, a mission fraught with uncertainty and risk, was now unfolding in the quietest, most precise way. The protagonist's refusal to follow orders and her insistence on using stealth and strategy instead of brute force had raised doubts. But as they moved deeper into enemy territory, her plan was proving itself. The goal was clear: rescue the hostages without drawing attention, without putting anyone at unnecessary risk. It was a delicate operation, one that required not just military skill, but patience, discipline, and a complete trust in the protagonist's vision. For the team, this was a test of everything they thought they knew about warfare. They had always been trained for the loud, direct confrontations, the glory of a successful assault. But now, they were moving like shadows, and the mission's success depended entirely on their ability to remain unseen, unnoticed by the enemy. The team moved quietly through the dense cover of night, each member carrying out their role with precision. The protagonist's careful planning was evident at every step, the paths she had mapped out, the points of entry, the systems she had hacked to disable enemy surveillance. They were no longer just soldiers following orders. They were executing a meticulously crafted plan that would require complete cooperation, every single person working in sync, without a moment of hesitation. The first step in the plan was the infiltration of the enemy compound. It was heavily guarded, the air thick with tension, but the protagonist had anticipated the layout. They moved through hidden paths, silent as ghosts, undetected by the sentries. Every move had been rehearsed, and every member of the team knew exactly where to go and what to do. They were silent, they were fast, and most importantly, they were unpredictable. At the same time, the protagonist worked in the shadows, coordinating the movements of her team through hidden communication devices. She couldn't afford to take her eyes off the situation for a second. Every bit of information she had gathered, every piece of intel, was being put to use right now. The enemy had no idea they were there. The protagonist's gamble was paying off. They were inside without a single shot being fired, without a single alarm raised. As they reached the area where the hostages were being held, the tension increased. The protagonist, knowing the importance of timing, signaled the team to remain still. They were on the edge now, on the brink of a discovery, and the hostages were just a few rooms away. The air seemed heavier here. The room they were about to enter was guarded by at least 4 enemies, heavily armed, but spread out and unaware of the team's approach. The team took their positions, and without a word, the protagonist made the first move. Using a silenced weapon, she took out one of the guards at a distance, signaling for the rest of the team to move in swiftly. With the remaining guards eliminated quietly, the team entered the room where the hostages were held. The sight was devastating. The hostages, disoriented and physically drained, looked up as the door opened. The protagonist felt a pang of guilt, but she knew that this moment was what they had trained for, to be the ones who could change the outcome of a hostage situation, to be the ones who could provide safety when all seemed lost. She could see the fear in their eyes, but also the faintest glimmer of hope. The plan was working, but the hardest part was still to come, getting the hostages out. Every second counted. The moment the team began freeing the hostages, they would become vulnerable. The enemy would know that their most valuable asset had been taken, and they would retaliate swiftly. The protagonist knew that any delay would jeopardize everything. With the hostages freed, the next part of the plan kicked. In the escape, the protagonist had mapped out the quickest route to safety, one that would avoid any major enemy positions. But just as they were about to move, an unexpected problem arose, a security breach that hadn't been accounted for. One of the hostages, panicked and unable to control their emotions, triggered a motion sensor near the exit. The sound of an alarm echoed through the halls, signaling that their cover had been blown. The team immediately sprung into action, and the protagonist took charge, directing everyone with a calm authority. There was no time to waste. As the enemy began mobilizing, they had to move quickly to avoid being surrounded. The plan had changed, but they were ready. The protagonist led the way, guiding the hostages through the narrow passages she had studied so well, each step becoming more urgent. As the team reached the extraction point, the sound of enemy forces closing in was deafening. The protagonist knew this was it. They had to move fast. They reached the designated pickup zone, where a transport vehicle was waiting. The hostages, now safely secured, were loaded onto the vehicle, and the team began to board. But just as they thought they were clear, a final obstacle appeared. The enemy had launched a last-minute attempt to trap them. a sudden barrage of gunfire erupted, and the team was forced to engage in a quick firefight. The protagonist acted without hesitation, giving orders to her team, making sure they were positioned in a way that minimized casualties. They fought with the precision of a well-trained unit, and within moments, the enemy forces were retreating. The transport vehicle sped off into the night, the team and the hostages safe for the moment. The protagonist allowed herself a brief sigh of relief, but she knew this was far from over. The operation had been a success, but it had also proven that every decision, every moment, was a matter of life and death. As the team moved toward their next safe location, the protagonist couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The strategy she had been so heavily criticized for was now seen in a new light. The mission was a success, and they had done it without the heavy losses they would have suffered with a direct attack. But even in the aftermath of their victory, she understood that there would be those who would never truly understand the depth of the decision she had made. But, for now, that didn't matter. The hostages were safe. The team had survived, and her strategy had worked. After the successful rescue of the hostages and the flawless execution of the plan, everything seemed to have fallen into place. The protagonist, once doubted and questioned for her refusal to follow the direct attack order, had proven everyone wrong. Her strategy, though initially criticized, had worked. The team was safe, the hostages were free, and the enemy had been outwitted. Yet, the story was far from over. The success of the mission had set the stage for an unexpected revelation that would change everything. And it all began to unravel when the truth started to surface. Despite the successful completion of the mission, the protagonist could feel the air shift as she returned to base. She had done what she set out to do, but the tension between her and her team hadn't fully dissipated. Even though the hostages were safe and the operation had been flawless, there was still an undercurrent of resentment toward her refusal. Some team members, though now understanding the reasoning behind her decision, still struggled to accept it. Others simply couldn't forgive what they perceived as insubordination. For the protagonist, this wasn't just about proving her worth as a leader, it was about changing the way her team saw her. She had hoped that, in time, they would understand that her decision wasn't a cowardly one, but a necessary one. However, as time passed, the whispers of doubt and the lingering distrust began to gnaw at her, creating an internal struggle that only grew worse with each passing day. It wasn't long before the whispers started becoming louder. The commander, who had once been adamantly against her decision, began to privately acknowledge the results of the operation. While he hadn't fully come around to agree with her approach, he couldn't deny that her strategy had been effective. Still, the damage had been done. The team saw her refusal as an act of defiance, and no amount of justification could erase the lingering question: was her decision an act of brilliance, or was it an insubordination that nearly jeopardized the mission? It wasn't until one fateful evening that the full extent of the truth came to light. The protagonist was called into a private meeting with the commander. She had expected this moment, the moment where he would either tear into her for her actions or commend her for her strategic thinking. What she hadn't expected was the quiet admission that followed. The commander, who had been visibly disappointed by her refusal, looked at her not with anger but with a strange, almost regretful understanding. "I couldn't see it at the time," he began, his voice low, as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. "I didn't understand why you couldn't just follow the order. But now, I see it. You didn't act out of cowardice. You acted because you understood the bigger picture, something I didn't." For the protagonist, those words meant more than any applause. In that moment, she realized that the man who had condemned her had come to understand the weight of her decision. But it wasn't just about gaining his approval. She knew that her decision had not only changed the way the mission had been executed, but it had changed the way she viewed herself and the way others viewed her too. However, the true revelation came not from her interactions with her team, but from something much more dangerous: the enemy's response to their successful rescue mission. The protagonist had always suspected that there was more at play. But it wasn't until the encrypted communication intercepted by her team reached the higher command that the full scope of the PS situation unfolded. While the mission had been successful, the enemy, though temporarily outmaneuvered, had planned a more insidious retaliation than anyone could have expected. The protagonist's decision to avoid the direct confrontation had inadvertently set in motion a more dangerous sequence of events. The enemy, who had initially underestimated the rescue operation, had launched a counterattack on another front, targeting not just the military outposts, but civilian centers that the protagonist had not anticipated. The truth was this: the enemy had been more prepared than they had thought. The protagonist's refusal to follow the direct assault had, in fact, drawn attention to a vulnerability they hadn't seen coming. The enemy was now on the move. And their response was not a simple military counterattack. Was a calculated retaliation against civilians and local forces. This revelation hit hard. But there was more to the truth. The commander and the higher-ups had known that the risk of such a response existed, but they had never shared the full scope of the enemy's plans with the team. In fact, the information about the counterattack had been kept under wraps, making it clear that they had been prepared for the worst but hadn't told the protagonist or the team. The shock came when the protagonist uncovered that the mission, while a success, had also unknowingly set off a series of events that no one could have foreseen. The revelation of the enemy's retaliatory strategy was difficult for the protagonist to process. She had been playing a long game trying to save lives while outsmarting the enemy. Yet, in the end, her decision had led to even more complex challenges. The civilian targets that the enemy had chosen were now at risk, and the safety of those people rested on the very decisions she had made. But what was even more difficult to bear was the fact that the higher-ups had known about the enemy's plans from the beginning but had kept it from her. In the commander's private confession, it became clear that the bigger picture had always been in their hands. Yet they had let her lead without giving her the full knowledge of what they had expected. She had been operating in the dark, doing what she thought was best, while the true scope of the situation remained hidden from her. This truth forced the protagonist to confront her own vulnerabilities. How could she have made better decisions if she had known the full truth? How could she have outmaneuvered the enemy without putting more people at risk? The self-doubt crept in. Despite the success of the operation, the weight of the mission's fallout, combined with the knowledge that the stakes had been even higher than she had thought, made her question everything. Despite the revelations and the consequences, one thing remained certain: the protagonist had made the right decision. In refusing the direct order, she had followed her instincts and played the long game, even when everyone else doubted her. Now, she was faced with the task of figuring out how to mitigate the fallout of the enemy's retaliation and how to prepare for the next phase of the war. In the end, this revelation didn't just change how others saw her, it changed how she saw herself. No longer just the soldier who followed orders. She had become a leader who charted her own course, even when the truth wasn't clear. What do you think of the protagonist's journey? Do you believe that her decision was worth the hidden consequences? Or do you think she should have known more? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're still hooked on this story and can't wait to see what happens next, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications for the next exciting chapter. The journey is far from over. What had initially seemed like a carefully planned and executed mission was now facing its true test. After the hostages were rescued and the enemy forces neutralized, the protagonist, her team, and the military command felt they had successfully outsmarted the opposition. The mission had been a tactical triumph, proving the value of her unorthodox strategy. Yet, the real danger wasn't over. The real test was just beginning. And it would come from a direction no one could have predicted. In the midst of the post-mission debrief, as the adrenaline began to wear off, and the team started to breathe easier, the quiet hum of communication devices suddenly went quiet. Then, an encrypted message came through. It wasn't just from the enemy forces they had just fought against, it was from a new faction, one that had been operating under the radar. The protagonist's initial victory was far from the end. It was only a temporary setback for a much larger more powerful adversary. The enemy's response was swift and far-reaching. What was meant to be a local victory soon turned into a global issue. The faction that had been watching from the sidelines had now decided to intervene directly. They had been biding their time, watching the mission unfold, waiting for a weakness to exploit, and in their eyes, that weakness was not the battlefield, it was the protagonist's very approach to leadership. The enemy's new plan was simple but devastating. Use the protagonist's earlier refusal to follow the order to sow distrust within the ranks of her team and to undermine her credibility in front of higher command. The real twist wasn't the physical battle, it was the psychological war that was about to unfold. The protagonist's refusal to follow the direct order had set a dangerous precedent. The higher-ups had never planned for this kind of insubordination, especially not in a mission of this magnitude. The military command, caught off guard by the outcome, began to question everything. They didn't just wonder if the protagonist was the right leader, they began to wonder if they had made a mistake. By not overseeing the operation more closely, as whispers of doubt spread through the ranks, the protagonist realized she was being used as a pawn in a game much bigger than she had ever anticipated. The enemy wasn't just attacking her team physically, they were attacking her very foundation of leadership, playing on her vulnerabilities, sowing seeds of discord and distrust among her own soldiers. The impact of this psychological warfare was felt most deeply by her team. Some of the soldiers, who had stood by her through thick and thin, began to question her decisions. The sense of loyalty they had once felt was now fractured. They knew the mission had been a success, but the consequences of going against direct orders were beginning to take their toll. The team had been led into a situation they hadn't fully understood. And now they were beginning to question everything, every strategy, every action, and every decision. As the external threat of the enemy continued to evolve, the protagonist found herself battling an even more formidable force. Her own doubts: had her decision been worth it? Had her strategy truly saved lives, or had it simply delayed the inevitable? The pressure mounted, and as the psychological warfare waged on, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. In private moments, she replayed the events of the mission over and over, wondering if there had been another way. She knew she couldn't change the past, but the internal struggle gnawed at her, making her question her every move. The psychological weight of being at the center of the conflict, with so much at stake, was more than she had bargained for. Yet, despite the turmoil within, she knew that to lead her team through this storm, she would have to dig deeper. She could not afford to show weakness. Her team needed a leader, not just someone who made strategic decisions, but someone who could navigate the mental and emotional challenges of war. The battle was no longer just against the enemy, it was against the fractures within her own mind, her own leadership. The seeds of division were already planted. There were those within the team who stood by her decision, who understood that the mission's success proved the correctness of her approach. But there were others, including some of her closest allies, who were beginning to wonder if they had been misled. The atmosphere was thick with distrust, and the unity that had once defined the team now felt fragile, strained. That the protagonist knew that the cracks in the team's morale would only widen unless something changed. She couldn't afford to let the enemy win, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who fought beside her. She had to rebuild that trust, not through orders, but through understanding and open communication. But this would take time. And time was running out. The final confrontation wouldn't be a simple physical battle, it would be a test of the protagonist's ability to reclaim her leadership, to prove that her refusal had been the right call. As the team moved toward their next objective, the protagonist realized that the true enemy was not the forces they were facing, but the doubts that were threatening to tear them apart from the inside. The protagonist would have to fight not just for the success of the mission, but for the very unity of her team. She had always believed that leadership was about making hard choices, about doing what was right, even when no one else understood. But now, more than ever, she would need to demonstrate that she could lead her team not just through action, but through understanding, empathy, and unshakable resolve. Now that you've seen the true twist of the story, how do you think the Protagonist will deal with the psychological warfare she's facing. Will she be able to regain her team's trust and face the external threat, or will the fractures within her team be too much to overcome? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're hooked on this gripping story and want to find out what happens next, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications. This journey is far from over, and the next chapter is going to be a game changer. As the protagonist stood at the edge of a new, even more dangerous phase of the operation, everything had changed. Her strategy had worked, at least in the short term. The hostages were freed. The initial victory was in the bag, and the mission was considered a success by all. But now, she faced a new challenge, holding her team together and completing the mission while grappling with the repercussions of her earlier decision, the psychological toll of being branded a coward, of defying orders and risking everything for a seemingly untested strategy, was eating away at her. But it wasn't just about the external judgment anymore. She had to confront herself, the weight of her decisions, and whether she was truly capable of leading her team to success through the storm of doubt and division she had unintentionally created. Her true test of leadership was unfolding right before her eyes. The operation was far from over. Although the enemy had been outmaneuvered, they were regrouping, preparing for their own retaliation. The protagonist knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. She could feel the weight of the mission pressing down harder than ever. But what made the situation even more daunting was the constant division within her team. With every day, the cracks became more evident. Soldiers who had once looked to her for guidance now questioned her every decision. Some were still on her side, standing firm in the belief that her strategy was the only way to secure a lasting victory. But others had grown increasingly frustrated, their trust shaken to its core. The enemy may have been a formidable force, but the real enemy within the protagonist's team was a growing mistrust that threatened to undo everything they had worked for. It was clear now that the team would never survive if they remained fractured. The protagonist knew she couldn't force them to follow her. She would need to earn back their trust, not with grand gestures, but with a single decisive act that would demonstrate the strength of her leadership. A critical part of the operation had been delayed due to a mistake made by one of her team members. It was a small error, a misstep that could have easily been corrected, but it was enough to put the entire mission in jeopardy. The enemy had caught wind of their movements and was preparing for an ambush. Time was running out, and the protagonist knew they would be trapped if they didn't act fast. The room was tense, the atmosphere thick with apprehension. There was no time for words or reassurances. The protagonist had to act. She needed to make a decision that would put everything on the line. A decision that would either unite the team or tear them apart once and for all. Standing at the head of the room, she addressed her team with unwavering authority. We have two choices. We can let this mistake define us, let it fester and destroy the mission. Or we can fix it, right here, right now. I need you all to trust me, just like you did before. We have one chance, and it's going to take every one of us to make this work. But we don't have time for doubts anymore. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She knew that this was the critical moment, where her leadership would either be solidified or lost forever. She couldn't afford to waver. She couldn't afford to let her doubts or the growing tension within her team dictate the outcome of the mission. Then, one by one, the soldiers stood, stepping forward and reaffirming their commitment to the plan. The protagonist saw it in their eyes, the trust, the resolve. They were willing to follow her once more, not because of her orders, but because they believed in her decision, and in the strategy that had worked against the odds. The protagonist could feel the shift in the room. The fracture, though still present, had begun to heal. They weren't just following orders anymore, they were working together as a unit again. The team had finally rallied around her, united by the singular goal of seeing the mission through. No matter the cost, the team moved swiftly into action. With the enemy closing in, the protagonist's plan was put into motion with precision. Every member of the team played their part, executing the steps with the kind of synchrony that only true trust can foster. The protagonist's decision to refuse the initial order had, in the end, set them on a course that required this very unity. As the operation unfolded, the enemy was caught off guard by the cleverness of their strategy. The ambush was avoided, the enemy was neutralized, and the mission was, once again, a success. But this time, it wasn't just the tactical victory that mattered, it was the unity and resolve of the team that had made it possible. In that moment, the protagonist knew that her refusal, though difficult and costly at the time, had been the catalyst for the team's growth. They had faced their doubts, their frustrations, and their fears, and come out stronger on the other side. The mission had tested them all, but it had also forged a bond that no failure could undo. As the mission wrapped up and the dust settled, the protagonist stood in quiet reflection. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over yet. But, in that moment, she knew that leadership wasn't about being perfect, it was about making the tough calls. The ones no one else dares to make, and standing by them with conviction. It was about leading not with commands, but with heart. She had learned that being a leader meant being vulnerable, showing that the weight of decisions was something she carried to. It was a lesson in humility and strength, in trust and responsibility. And while the path forward would be filled with challenges, she was ready to face them head-on, knowing that the greatest victories come not from following the crowd, but from leading it with conviction. What do you think? Do you believe the protagonist's decision was truly the right one? Was it the act of a strong leader, or was there another way she could have brought her team together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're enjoying this thrilling journey and want to see how it all concludes, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications. You won't want to miss the explosive final chapter of this story.